Hi, and welcome to Crash Course Cryptozoology. It's been a long time since I've had a continuous or consistent stream of videos on this main channel, mainly for working for documentaries and other projects. But I'd like to bring back these regular videos and also bring it back with something of a significant and complicated subject. DNA is an exceedingly important part of the classification of species, and because of this, cryptozoology is often filled with discussion about what it would take, if not DNA, or to what degree DNA would be needed to prove the existence of a given cryptid. And there is perhaps no other cryptid more talked about in this regard than the North American sasquatch. Over the years, there have been many attempted DNA studies on supposed Sasquatch hair samples, tissue samples, fecal matter, etc. And this is also a global phenomenon, spanning over into the Himalayas, wherein there have also been DNA studies on alleged Yeti evidence. This video in particular will focus on three of the most prominent examples of attempted Sasquatch DNA study in specifically North America. The point of discussing this subject in this manner is to outline the studies that have gone the furthest in attempting to categorize and prove the existence of the North American Sasquatch, and frame it as a sort of representative case on the subject of Sasquatch DNA. And of course, as previously mentioned, there are plenty of other examples, most examples being misidentified examples that, upon DNA study, have proven to be already known species. These results are somewhat different. The earliest and perhaps the most significant example of the three was brought about by the hit cryptozoology documentary series from History Channel, Monster Quest, produced by Doug Hychik. In Season 1 and in Season 2, Monster Quest investigated a case of reported Sasquatch activity with multiple sightings and related incidents at a place called Snellgrove Lake in Ontario, Canada. This lake was a fly-in fishing spot with a complete fishing cabin present, and in this cabin, many of the inhabitants who would stay there for periods of fishing reported the cabin being ransacked and harassed, essentially, by what they could not imagine was anything but a very large, unusual animal. The certain kinds of activity experienced not only by these people but also by Monster Quest crew, including rock throwing, as well as recent sightings from around the area, highly suggested that this could be classified as a potential case of Sasquatch encounter. During the Season 1 and Season 2 look at this area, the crew of Monster Quest attempted to attain physical evidence by placing a nailed board at the front door of the cabin. This was done because it would appear to be the most likely way to get some kind of physical evidence because of the consistency that this animal was approaching the cabin directly. Some kind of physical evidence was obtained in the form of tissue samples, quite possibly bloody tissue samples, left in a semi-large footprint shape on the nail board. And this was sent in to 3 different labs. One of the labs was headed by Dr. Todd Disattel, who is still heavily involved in the Sasquatch DNA discussion, and actually holds a PhD from Harvard in DNA analysis. Disatel's findings, which were the first of the 3, were that there was no viable DNA left in the sample to actually draw any kind of conclusion definitively. It may not have even been a biological sample. Todd Disattel was generous enough to give his own wording on this on the podcast Monster Talk. According to Disattel, quote, "We actually did not get DNA, so in a sense, I don't even have a result. There was not DNA present in the material given to us. Either that material was so degraded that any viable DNA within it had basically been destroyed by other organisms or by nature, or those were not biological samples." This result would be contended, however, by different labs. Kurt Nelson, a DNA analyst scientist with the University of Minnesota who also worked on the Monster Quest episode, had the samples brought into his lab and produced the conclusion that these were in fact biological samples, although there was some element of contamination in them, but once isolated, they showed mainly human characteristics but had several differences which related mostly to primates such as the chimpanzee. Kurt Nelson thought this was exceedingly significant, and went on to admit that upon seeing this, he himself considered he may be looking at the DNA of a previously unclassified North American primate. It's important to note as well that Kurt Nelson has been involved in some other projects regarding Sasquatch DNA, but has been honest throughout them, one of which being the Bigfoot corpse hoax, perpetuated especially by researcher Tom Biscardi, wherein Kurt Nelson determined that the samples found in the corpse belonged to a possum, which was correct. It was a rubber suit filled with the organs of other animals, especially including the possum. There is, however, some elaboration on this, as Disattel points out in the Monster Talk podcast he appeared on, that he was able to receive the sequences that Nelson himself looked at and draw his own conclusions. In his own words, Disattel said, "I actually eventually received those sequences. They were, I don't remember if it was 1 or 2 bases, different from human, but again, you and I might differ. So my interpretation of that result was, with very careful and selective editing, a 1 base difference in that region is still a human. It just might not be you. Might be the guy down the street. So I honestly think that particular example was just an example of laboratory contamination. And I can't tell you how often that happens. Our methods are so sensitive that, 1 molecule that you sneezed out last week on the tip of your pippeter might be the one that you end up analyzing. So the Canadian example of, we were very careful with it, I honestly don't think that base 1 different sequence, which falls completely in the realm of modern humans, and that was edited out. I analyzed that sequence as well. I found there are humans with an identical sequence to that. The human sequence they tested it against was base 1 different. There are other humans with exactly that same signature. Again, what do we mean by the human? Is that Yao Ming or Vernon Troyer? Is it the tallest guy you know or the shortest guy you know? Who's human? They're both human. We're variable. Disatel's point essentially here is that, yes, while there may be base differences in pieces of the genetic code that the DNA yielded in Kurt Nelson's study, he disagrees with Nelson that those base differences resemble something like a chimpanzee and may more so be accounted for simple differences in individual genetic code found in normal human populations. A third test on these sequences, or I suppose technically a 4th test, was conducted in Season 2 of Monster Quest by a molecular biologist with the University of Guelph named Dr. Mehrdad Hajibabai. The conclusions of this lab differed from both Disatel's 2 findings and the findings of Nelson, showing that the DNA in the sequences appeared to actually not belong to animals, but to plant matter, specifically certain kinds of fungus. As of right now, there has been no further testing done on the Ontario DNA tests, which might come as a bit of a shame, because there is no established pattern of consistency in results thus far across the different labs that this has been sent to. The only person who's tested it twice is Disattel, and even his results differed between each other. Which is not to say that any of the results are necessarily, specifically and by themselves, inaccurate, but there is a lack of a pattern of consistency, and unfortunately, without that, we're still not entirely sure what kind of sample we're looking at definitively. Moving forward in time, we come to the very controversial Melba Ketchum DNA findings. Melba Ketchum, who first had somewhat of a cryptozoological break by being consulted for DNA testing on the hit show Destination Truth, has a history of working in forensic crime study, which deals often with DNA studies, in order to identify perpetrators or people who were present at crime scenes. She eventually founded a research group called the Sasquatch Genome Project. There is a sort of tumultuous history to the study conducted by this group on 3 different alleged Sasquatch DNA examples that were sent into them, with many different researchers having known about the study being conducted, but being told to keep it quiet until a certain date. that date being February 3rd, 2013, when a paper on the study was officially put out by the Sasquatch Genome Project. This is where much of the controversy truly began. The results of the study indicated rather vague conclusions, essentially saying the DNA that was extracted revealed that the mitochondrial aspect of the DNA matched modern Homo sapiens, but that the nuclear DNA seemed to be of unknown primate origin. Something that supposedly the study could trace back 15,000 years ago and believed was a hybrid species of some sort. One of the largest reasons that this study has been so heavily critiqued is not only the vagueness of the results, essentially answering one unknown with another, but also the genetic plausibility of the study. There is no indication in the study of exactly how close this unknown primate, which was not listed as human, but again, unknown primate, was to modern Homo sapiens. In the animal kingdom, it's generally known that two species that are very similar can sometimes mate and produce offspring, but those offspring are nearly always infertile and are unable to actually produce a continuous species of their own. Because of this, the plausibility of a non-human primate and a modern Homo sapien being able to mate and produce a species that continuously was able to reproduce in its own populations, spanning back 15,000 years, is nearly impossible, genetically speaking. There is also the fact that the paper was not properly peer-reviewed, even though it was advertised as being looked at by multiple lead researchers. Perhaps one of the nails in the coffin comes in the form of a quote from Troy Hudson, who worked with the Sasquatch Genome Project, which shows, to some extent, a lack of proper understanding on the biology of the subject. "You're not dealing with an animal," explained Troy Hudson with the Sasquatch Genome Project. "You're dealing with something that walks on two legs, has children, and through other research and audio, they have a language." It can be contended, especially theologically in some of those groups, whether or not humans are to be considered animals. Scientifically speaking, there is nothing that separates a human from a non-human species in terms of classification as an animal. There is difference in classification of species and genus and all of the kingdom classifications except for kingdom, that being the animal kingdom. Just because something walks on two legs, has children, and has its own language, does not mean it is not an animal as well. Kangaroos walk on two legs and have children. And there are certain monkeys in Africa which portray specific audio signals for specific threats, which, essentially, is a rudimentary form of audio language. The paper is not really considered something viable by most of the Sasquatch field because, quite frankly, the results don't make a whole lot of sense, and there are a lot of indications that this is not a project that was peer-reviewed or had a proper amount of focus behind it. The most recent example of potential Sasquatch DNA analysis came in the form of the relatively new show Expedition Bigfoot. In 2021, potential environmental DNA samples from alleged Bigfoot nesting sites were sent in to the University of California, Davis, specifically to Miroslava Ramos, who heads the environmental DNA department at that university. There were, in fact, DNA samples found in the soil. In March of 2021, a partial report was sent to Expedition Bigfoot, which was published, which essentially said, although the samples were still undergoing testing phases, there were some significant finds already made. The main one being that of the many DNA samples collected from this sample set, they appeared to most closely match the Pan genus, which is the genus of animals including chimpanzees and bonobos, but that the DNA did not match specifically chimpanzee or specifically bonobo. To many people, including myself, this was a highly significant finding, not only because of the promise that it held, but also because of the closeness it had to Kurt Nelson's interpretation of the DNA evidence from the Monster Quest samples. However, around a year went by, and those final results which were being reached were never published by Expedition Bigfoot or elsewhere. I actually found the chance to get into contact with that department and spoke to one of the lab assistants there, who I will have remain anonymous here. In the email that I was sent back, it was disclosed that the research did conclude, and the results were that this was degraded human DNA, and that the appearance of the degradation made it resemble pangenus DNA, as pan DNA and homo DNA are very, very similar. While these results were sent into Expedition Bigfoot, they were not published by Expedition Bigfoot, and to this point, the show still has not acknowledged these findings, which, to be quite frank, is an extreme example of misleading viewers and the public on the potential of those findings. I want to make clear that I do not blame the main cast for this at all. It is very likely that there is a communication gap between the cast and the people who actually run the show, who are likely to be the ones who are actually aware of the results. These three examples of Sasquatch DNA study make one thing very clear, which is that there is a lack of consistency in the findings, and that's due to many reasons. Some of it is due to incompetence, some of it is due to controversy, and some of it is due to, perhaps, one could call it bad luck in terms of the sample itself. But one issue also seems to be that a lot of these samples don't get tested the amount of times that they would maybe need to get tested in order to be consistent. Because, as it stands, all of them are still disagreed upon. In order to get DNA that would highly suggest, at the very least, the existence of something like the Sasquatch, labs, multiple different labs, would need to get roughly or exactly the same result over and over again on a sample. What this would allow is not only a scientific agreement on what the sample seems to show, but it would also say there is a definitive identity to this that was not before recognized. And unfortunately, we haven't come across that yet. Whether or not we will is, of course, up in the air. That being said, until next time.